Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And thank you to Michael Harris for very thought-provoking analysis and presentation. I wanted that's why I asked the second Michael Theodore, if he could allow the third one, Michael LaRose, to go before me, because I wanted to hear what Michael LaRose said about England, because I think that coming back to Michael Harris's main thrust about democracy and state of emergency, that it was important to have heard that you had in England the abrogation of rights without the declaration of a state of emergency, in conditions where there was, quote unquote, civil disorder that could have perhaps been used as a justification for the imposition of a state of emergency. So you don't necessarily have to have a state of public emergency to have the abrogation of rights within a supposedly democratic society. And it was very important to have heard that from Michael. And I wanted, therefore, to, along that theoretical frame, to make the point and to reinforce what Michael LaRose said, that over the last 10 years, and you're right, certainly since 9/11, we have seen within those societies that have, quote-unquote, championed democracy throughout the world, which really is their form of Western liberal democracy in the framework of a capitalist economic system, and particularly within the framework of neoliberalism, which is the greater concentration of capital in the hands of fewer and fewer people at the expense of more and more. That within this framework, those countries that have championed democracy, in fact, have been moving towards neo-fascism. The Bush regime quite clearly was moving towards neo-fascism, and you're correct in terms of the Patriot Act and the presidential orders and so on. And the recent actions, for example, by NATO in bombing Gaddafi out of power, supposedly in the name of democracy, was really intervening in an internal civil war and coming down on one side against the other within an internal civil war, and was wrong. But that was not condemned internationally and so on. So in the UK, in the US, in France, with a number of actions and so on, in France and so on, we are seeing neo-fascism emerging. And yet we are in the illusion of the notion of democracy, and that is a contradiction that I think we need to examine more carefully. And it is particularly possible in conditions of an economic crisis, where people are thrown out of jobs and so on and so on and so on. And of course, those were the conditions in which Hitler came to power in the 30s in the first place. And in the context of our own economic crisis, it is easy for there to be the other who is demonized and therefore become the propaganda grist for the removal of rights. So I just wanted to say that, because I think that's important for us to appreciate in the global scheme of things. And therefore, Trinidad and Tobago, in a sense, is fitting in with the global scheme of things. Now, I just want to make two other points. One is about gangs. And I recall that the Oil Field Workers Trade Union, we organized a discussion about 4 years ago about crime and violence in the Caribbean. We invited Rupert Ryan and Brian Meeks and others. I don't know if, Michael, you were part of that one, but we had a really rich discussion, because we were looking at 40 years after the protests in Jamaica, what became popularly known as the Rodney riots of '68. But what happened between then, when young people in urban communities, the same young urban African Caribbean male, were on the streets in their numbers in protest against the status quo from Kingston to Georgetown. We looked at it. Kingston in '68, there was Antigua around '69 and so on, Trinidad 70, 71, Guyana shortly thereafter when Walter went back and so on to Guyana in 74 and onwards. What happened to those same young urban African males who were expressing their power through collective action on the streets to transform their reality and the societies by extension in a very positive way where their power was in terms of ideas, were radical political ideas, and in terms of mass action on the streets, to the point of expressing their power through a gun turned inwardly in gang violence. We have to trace that history. And we did that in that forum. I want to say that we organized that forum. We're going to have another one to deal with that. Because nobody in the society is looking at what happened systemically from the 60s to now. And it has to do with the education system and the total failure of the education system in terms of dealing with the possibility of social mobility of that section of the population, because the junior sec and senior sec and the CXCs and so on fail those young men and cause them to feel no sense of hope in social mobility. Secondly, there was systemic police action. And I want to say it was police action in Trinidad and Tobago. We praised Burroughs and so on, but Burroughs was at the root of the systemic police action for breaking up the blocks where young people in the 70s, young men in the 70s were discussing Fanon and Che and Rodney and progressive ideas and introducing hard drugs on those blocks and chasing them off and preventing them from engaging in ideas and instead replacing that with hard drugs. And we have to look at IMF structural adjustment, which destroyed the economies of East Port of Spain and so on, and led to other social fallout. So those are the three elements. And then in the course of that, we have to look at gangs as states within a state and discuss what the challenge of that is to the official state, where gangs now were dispensing more patronage at a local level than local government in terms of dealing with the needs of the communities that had been structurally adjusted in a negative way and so on. And those are the kinds of debates I think that we need to engage in a very serious way. So I just wanted to put that there. Lastly, I want to say that there's one part of the CJ speech address that, Michael, that you left out, which is where you also quoted the Constitution, which says in section 13 or 14 that actions by the state to abrogate rights, such as if you pass a law that infringes your constitutional right, you have to pass it by whatever percent and so on, depending on the nature of the abrogation, have to meet a constitutional test. Now, he didn't phrase it that way, but I'm paraphrasing. Which test is on, and I'm now quoting from the Constitution, that those things must be reasonably justifiable in a society that has a proper respect for the rights and freedoms of the individual. So that there is perhaps a legal framework, and perhaps the CJ may have been sending a signal that was not just the formal legality of the Constitution, but that the Constitution, because the Constitution has not been suspended, that constitutional test exists. And it'd be interesting to see whether people use that provision in the Constitution to test not the constitutionality of the state of emergency, but the constitutionality of some of the actions by the state forces, and also, in my view, the regulations. Because if the state of emergency was to address removal of guns, the crime, and the gangs, then certainly regulations that relate to possession of documents, holding public meetings and marches, and statements that are so-called prejudicial to the public order, that those three regulations ought to be removed immediately, right? And I certainly think that they cannot stand, those regulations cannot stand the test of what exists in terms of the reasons given for the emergencies. I wanted to raise that, identify that point, and to say that certainly is causing and will continue to cause tensions within the partnership, because different parties have different positions on that question. And picking up people on outstanding warrants for traffic offenses cannot be justified in a state of emergency that was to deal with gun violence, illegal firearms, drugs, and gangs. And I'll stop that.